I think at that time, there were a lot of people, well, maybe not a lot, but a little group of us, because I started out at Rochester and was working under Lionel McKenzie. And my thesis advisor was David Gale at Berkeley. And they were all working on multi-sector growth models. So that's what I've worked on. And we were studying stability issues and instability issues in multi-sector growth models. A lot of it was deterministic. And meanwhile, there was parallel work going on in the old Soviet Union. And so there wasn't any back talk at all from the profession on extending this kind of material to stochastic shocks. And I guess what surprises me to this day is how much this is used in so many areas in economics, for the DSGE models, new Keynesian models with the frictions, and the patterns that these kinds of stochastic models generate are endlessly fascinating. And I'll talk later about how they show up in ecology and other sciences. Very, very similar mathematical structure. The earlier literature, a lot of it focused on so-called deterministic models, which didn't generate any quasi-random looking patterns. But then at that time, there was a debate going on in economics that if you saw random-looking patterns being generated by the economy, like random fluctuations in GDP and employment and price level and so on, there must be something going wrong. But then what the real business cycle literature and other literature showed is that these models on the surface can generate somewhat similar-looking patterns when you power them by stochastic shocks. And so I think that played a role in stimulating literature. How do you distinguish between random looking patterns in a well-functioning economy where there's not a lot of stuff going wrong that can be corrected by public policy, and an economy that's generating these patterns because there's really something going wrong that public policy can correct? And so I think that's even still an active area in economic science, just trying to figure out how do you tell? And who should bear the burden of proof in policy interventions? So, and this is for somebody like me that comes at this from a background of applied mathematics, this is just endlessly fascinating. Well, I think part of it, goes back to the patterns. So that's what economists call risk, where the probabilities are known. But the mechanisms that are generating them are unknown, which raises the possibility that maybe you need to hedge against stuff that you don't know. I think it was Donald Rumsfeld that had the famous phrase about there's known knowns and there's known unknowns, and then there's the unknown unknowns, the unknowns that we don't know, and trying to figure out how public policy should deal with these different layers of uncertainty. And right now I'm working on a project with Lars and Mike Barnett where Lars flags a trinity, what I call a trinity of uncertainties. There's risk where the probabilities are known, and that's the kind of stuff that dates clear back to casino gambling, where you could figure out the probabilities that the dice will turn up with snake eyes and so on. Whereas the uncertainties, like ambiguity aversion, which is made famous by Daniel Ellsberg and others, and misspecification, that all models are wrong, but some models are useful, as the joke goes. That they're misspecified. Even these big climate models, which I'll talk about later, are misspecified. because you just can't get all of the aspects of a complex system down into the code that goes into even a highly complex, finely gridded, fine-scaled model. You just can't get it all in there. That's really tough, because Lyndon Johnson allegedly said when his economists said, well, Mr. President, next year's GNP is forecasted to be within this range here. And Johnson allegedly snapped, ranges are for cattle, give me a number. I mean, I've noticed that in my own interaction with public policy authorities, that they want a number, and if you give them a range, then what they're afraid of is that people that are coming at the same public policy issue that may have malintent will use that vacuum that you give them. Because if you don't just name a number, they'll use that vacuum you give them to propose a policy that could be quite malevolent. But that's not all of it. Part of it is just the people, and especially in something like climate, that's a good example. Everybody thinks they know about the weather, and people, when you talk to them about uncertainty in economics, everybody will say, well, I rent a car, I go shopping, I know all about the economy. So to get the lay public at large and policymakers to go from individual experience to what's happening in a system like the economy, where everybody's interacting with other people, that determines the equilibrium or quasi-equilibrium movements of the economy. That's very difficult. It's kind of like a composition effect from the individual scale to the aggregate scale, and that's a concept that's hard to communicate to non-scientists. To answer that question, you have to get inside the mind of a policymaker, which is hard for for a scientific economist or any other scientist to answer, because they're in a different thought space. The policymakers in a thought space shaped by their own training and experiences, whereas scientists are in another thought space shaped by their own training and experience. And how do you get the two thought spaces to communicate? I mean, one thing that a co-author of mine did in working on lake systems is that he designed a lake game where the policymakers were invited to manage the lake. And so they had opposing interests, like the agricultural sector is dumping manure into the watershed of Lake Mendota, say, which causes the lake to be over-nutrified, called eutrophication, a technical term, which causes the green slime, which is extremely unpleasant in the summertime and causes fish kills. So then that sector wants to keep pushing the lake, using it basically as a disposal of manure and so on, because each cow generates so much manure and they got to find a place to put it. But then meanwhile, you have the recreational interests, the fishing interests, and the people that want to swim and all of that. They're pushing to stop this. And so the policymakers caught in between. How do they manage a system like this? And this is a small-scale system, much less the economy or the planet. So how do you do that? Well, so what he does is he designs his lake game based on scientific models of the lake, which I've worked on with him, among others. And so the policymakers try to manage this lake. And just like doing video gaming, the lake typically crashes, because they'll let agriculture is constantly putting pressure on them, and they're losing points. Because as the agricultural sector and the lobbies and so on get more and more ticked off, they lose points. And meanwhile, the lake looks clean. See, initially, at the time of the Native Americans, it was it was oligotrophic, the technical term, for a lake that's not over-nutrified. And there's no slime and all of that kind of stuff. And the water was pure. You could see way down. And so as a result, since there's you don't see damages in the model, and I guess they have a little video screen and so on, so you can see the lake. Looks like the time of Native Americans. So they keep putting on pressure, and allowing more and more manure because they're losing points, like a real political game. And then the lake all of a sudden goes bad because there's alternative stable states in these small-scale systems in ecology, the lake of which is an example. And so now what do? Well, you start cracking down on agriculture, but you're not getting any results, because what happens is once you flip the lake, when you have an alternative stable state system, you have to undo the damage way beyond the initial trigger point of the damage, and that's called a hysteresis loop or hysteresis cycle. It comes up a lot in these systems. And so it just looks like you're not getting anywhere at all, but meanwhile, the recreational interests and the fishing interests are beating up on you. So you're losing points, and so many of them crash the lake. But what they learn is then they'll receive a briefing, and then they'll play the game again after receiving a briefing, and they get much better at it. So I've always thought that policymakers really ought to be induced to do gaming exercises. And I've never seen that really pushed except in these small-scale systems. And I think if we did something like that, it would be much easier, because then people are getting tactile interactions with uncertainty in a mimicking of real life.
Can academics play a role in designing these types
Oh,
of
yeah,
things?
just like Steve Carpenter, who designed this system. That's been used up in the lake districts of Wisconsin. And because that's kind of a hotbed of interactions between both sides, as well as the people living around Lake Mendota. And I think there's a high promise in something like that. And I haven't seen that kind of angle used in pushing scientists to communicate uncertainty. And I think that'd be one way of doing it. It would work fairly well on small-scale systems like rangelands, because you can flip a rangeland if you allow excessive grazing. What'll happen is that the nutritious grass will get flipped to basically woody shrubs, and the rangeland's rendered worthless. So that's very much like the lake being flipped into an undesirable eutrophic state, with slimy swimming and slick water and so on. And the same type of hysteresis loops show up in small-scale systems of rangelands. Now, the same kind of thing, could happen with inducing extreme events in climate. Some people are arguing in climate science that some of the reason that we're observing extreme events, even polar vortices in the Midwest and elsewhere in the planet, that a possible causal agent is emissions of CO2 into the atmosphere. I think that was fascinating, because when I started thinking about the self-consistency aspect of rational expectations, it's a logically neat idea that expectations of agents ought to be consistent with the models that you put the agents in. That's kind of like a mathematical fixed point problem, which of course is fascinating to mathematicians, never ending, especially since it's infinite dimensional. But that's the kind of thing that, when you try to explain that to somebody in the public, they roll their eyes and say, how about them Packers, which is, they want to talk about football or anything but that. But I got to thinking about rational expectations from a slightly different angle with a guy at University of Amsterdam named Cars Hommes, Hommes, who runs an institute called CENDEF. It's a big institute where the idea of the research that we did is, let's suppose that it's expensive for any economic agent to learn fully structural rational expectations, like what was made famous at Chicago and other places. So we called that rational expectations. The idea being that if every agent was using a fully structural rational expectations, it wouldn't be worthwhile for me to use it as it's kind of like a paradox of rational expectations. So what I ought to do is just use some cheap, simple, backward-looking predictor that doesn't cost me any effort to get. I don't have to pay any money. I don't have to pay tuition at Chicago or anything like that to get that predictor. That's available for free. You can be a blockhead and predict that way, but it costs nothing. But if everybody else is using fully structural rational expectations, there are situations where it doesn't pay me. So what I should do is just ride free on everybody else's effort. But then if everybody rides free on everybody else's effort, then there are settings where it's worthwhile for me to pay the effort to have fully structural rational expectations. So this inspired us to create an ecology of expectations, which we allowed to dynamically evolve over time, just like an ecological system of species. So there's multiple species of expectations, and then we allow them to evolve over time, and you can prove mathematical theorems about such systems, and you can also simulate them on a computer. Well, looking at the patterns generated by such systems, they actually look a lot like the patterns generated by the economic system. So that raises an interesting inferential problem. How can you tell, which periods a lot of the agents are actually being fully rational in their expectations, and which periods are they not? And that stimulated a lot of research and laboratory experiments where agents will actually be put in settings where they have an incentive to predict correctly. But yet what it is they're predicting is all determined by the predictions of everybody in the experiment. So then you can actually watch in the lab how expectations evolve in these experiments. And the CENDEF lab in Amsterdam in the Netherlands has become quite famous for that kind of work. It's very popular in Europe, where I don't know, for some reason the Europeans tend to be really skeptical, about what they would think of as excessive rationality. I guess when they live in a society where a lot of things have gone wrong in the past, whereas we've lived a fairly shouldered life in the United States, I think it changes the mindset. And so they're much more open to these alternative approaches. At least that's what I've found. Yeah, well, it's kind of like in the Sloan proposal, I'd written some stuff that was stimulated by the research that I just described. And I think this is a fantastic opportunity to kind of push what I might call a more conventional economics in these less conventional directions, because you've got the sort of what I consider the best people on the planet have been recruited for this project. And then I'm also working with Lars Hansen and Mike Barnett on the trinity of uncertainties in climate science. Because this is a good test bed for a lot of bump type work, because you have fairly precise climate science models, but they're formulated by different groups, and they're the cutting edge of technology in modeling the complex system of the climate. And each one of these models, when you simulate them, and you force the model with an injection of CO2 to kind of mimic what's been injected in the past, together with so-called RCP scenarios, different rates of injection that have been simulated and mentioned by the IPCC in its various rounds. So you end up getting, each one of these models generates an approximately linear relationship between the cumulative amount of carbon you've injected into the system at date t and the global mean average yearly temperature increase at date t. You get a nice linear looking relationship, and it's approximate and it's rough, but it's kind of striking. But that's the good news. But the bad news is that each different group with their own model does the same kind of simulations, and the slopes are different. So we've been using that as a measure of cross-model uncertainty in climate science. You know, the one that has the highest slope is the one that does the most damage to the economy if it's true. And the one that has the lowest slope is the one that does the least damage to the economy if it's true. But we don't know which one is true. Maybe none of them are true. So what do you do if you're advising a policymaker? One study that I did in monetary policy with two other guys named Ken West and Stephen Durloff, who is here now, but he was at Wisconsin at the time we did this. What we proposed doing is you would look at the best that you could do under each of these models. You know, imagine you apply this to climate rather than monetary policy. So you look at the best that you can do, you get a measure of welfare, and you get a measure of action, like maybe the average amount of emissions you allow. You know, because if you cut emissions too much, you harm the economy. And then what we should report to policymakers is what we called an action dispersion plot, which, so you would show the policymaker the dispersion of actions and the dispersion of welfare. So you're going to get quite a dispersion. But the policymaker, their job is to aggregate the preferences of the public. And so we took the position in that particular work that the scientific team should just present the policymaker with this dispersion, and it's your job to aggregate the preferences of the public because you're the elected representatives. You decide. That we really don't have a right to impose any kind of, expected utility or anything like that on your decision. I had that question asked me when with by a bunch of graduate students at the University of Missouri, and they asked exactly the same question. And I asked them, "How many of your parents have fire insurance?" And of course, they all held up their hands. Everybody bought fire insurance. How many of you have experienced How many of you have experienced a fire in your home? None. So I said, "Why are you buying fire insurance?" And then they all said, "Oh, we get it. Yeah, because you got to buy insurance." So then the big question is, how much insurance, that fascinates me, how much insurance are you actually purchasing with a given amount of emissions reduction? How much are you actually purchasing? That's a hard question, and I think that's another thing that excites me about BUMP, because we're actually thinking about answering exactly that question. I think one thing that we're pretty sure to get is we're going to have a much sharper way of articulating how you should respond and how much you should respond to each of the trinity of uncertainties. Risk, which was already pretty well understood, ambiguity, which is becoming better understood, and misspecification, which is probably not all that well understood because there are so many different forms that can take. but I think we'll have a much sharper understanding. And then I'm hoping also, that with all the different directions that we're working in BUMP, that we'll also be able to articulate, and the small part of it that I'm playing, what I'm hoping to get across is that in these smaller scale systems, which are still very important, where it's possible to have alternative stable states, I've worked with teams of people where we've done a lot of work on early warning signals. It turns out that when there's a slow-moving process, and that's unobservable, and that's what causes a lot of these flips to alternative stable states in these smaller scale systems, that you get an early warning signal in many of these where the variance increases before the flip. So you can take action before the system actually gets flipped into an undesirable stable state. So I think we'll, if you couple that kind of work with the trinity of uncertainties, I think there's going to be really exciting advances come out of that. So it'll be new science that we can report, which I'm pretty sure that we'll end up getting. And I think that it'll be pretty hard for a lot of other groups that receive an equal amount of funding to do better. In fact, I would be very surprised if any of them do better.